Hello, good morning, and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. These are the topics that we shall be discussing today. But before that, an update on our NCERT free crash course. We are covering our Constitution at Work, Indian Constitution at Work, which is a textbook in political science for class 11th. We have covered 4 lectures till now, and today at 6 o'clock we shall be discussing lecture number 5 dealing with the legislature. And please join me live at 6 o'clock and let's cover chapter number 5. So let's get started and let's look at topic number 1. Watching child sex abuse material is an offence, says the Supreme Court. The year was 2012. A law was passed called POCSO, Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. This is a law of 2012 which ensures that children are protected from sexual assault as well as from child pornography. In this case, now the Supreme Court has further strengthened this law, made this law more stringent, and now it remains to be seen how this law is implemented on the ground. For that, we need to understand Section 15 of the POCSO Act, because this is where the court had to interpret Section 15 very, very broadly. This Section 15 of the POCSO Act was initially meant to criminalize those persons who are storing or possessing child pornography material but for commercial purposes. Section 15 of the POCSO Act was initially meant to criminalize those people who are storing, who are consuming this pornographic material, child pornographic material, but with the intention of selling it for commercial purposes. But then in 2019, 3 more sections got added, or we can say the Section 15 of the POCSO Act was amended and 3 sections were made part of it. What are these 3 sections? Number 1, any person who stores or possesses this pornographic material which involves a child but does not delete this content, does not destroy this content, does not report this content to the police, to the authorities, which means you have the intention of sharing or transmitting this child pornographic material. This is an offence under Section 15 Clause 1 of the POCSO Act, which means if you are storing or possessing child pornographic material, but you did not delete it, you did not destroy it, you did not report it to the police, which means there is an intention that you wanted to transmit or share this child pornographic material. But you wanted to share may not only be for commercial purposes, or may not have been entirely for commercial purposes, may have been for lust. And when you are sharing it and transmitting it with other friends. Second, any person who stores or possesses this child pornographic material involving a child, but this time for displaying it, for transmitting it, for distributing it, it is an offence. And the third one is, if you are storing or possessing this pornographic material in any form, but this time you are doing this, you are storing it, possessing it for commercial purpose, this is a crime. So POCSO Act of 2012 was enacted by the Indian Parliament to protect children. And who are these children? Under the age of 18 years. To protect them from sexual assault, to protect them and save them from child pornography, this law was passed. Now the matter was before the Madras High Court. Why? Because a man, a 28-year-old man in Madras, had downloaded 2 child pornographic videos. But he did not share it, he did not distribute it, he did not sell it for commercial purpose. His only crime was he downloaded these 2 child pornographic videos. That's it. When the matter went to the Madras High Court quashed the proceedings against this man, saying if he would have stored it for commercial purpose, then it is a crime. If he would have displayed it with some other individuals, then it is a crime. If he had the intention of sharing it with others, then it is a crime. But since his only crime was to download these 2 child pornographic videos, that does not mean it is an offence under section 15 of the POCSO Act. And this FIR, these proceedings against this 28-year-old man, they were quashed on the orders of the Madras High Court. Matter went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said even mere possession of this child pornographic material is an offence under section 15 of the POCSO Act. Why? Now listen to me carefully. Supreme Court said when you look at these 3 offences, these offences we can call as inchoate offences. Inchoate offences in the sense, offences that you are perpetrating, committing in anticipation of a further crime. Sir, what does that mean? Intention is very important factor when it comes to a criminal case. You should have the intention of committing a crime. Sir, what does that mean? For example, you and me, we are walking together, we are going down the stairs, I accidentally hit you, you fell down the stairs and ultimately you are dead. Will I be punished for murder? No, because my intention was not to push you and kill you. But if I am deliberately pushing you down the stairs and ultimately you die, then I will be charged for murder, because now my intention was, through my act, by deliberately pushing you, that my intention was to commit murder. Intention is very important when it comes to deciding criminal matters. But here what the Supreme Court is saying, listen to me carefully, all these 3 offences are inchoate offences, which means these are the offences that you are perpetrating, committing in anticipation of a further crime. Through this you want to commit further crime. And what is this further crime? The court said, if this 28-year-old man downloaded 2 child pornographic videos, but he did not destroy it, he did not delete it, he did not inform this to the authorities, which means you had now the intention to do what? To share or transmit these videos with others, which is an offence under section 15 of the POCSO Act. That means if your intention was not to, if your intention was to delete it, you would have deleted it. But since you did not, that means your intention is to commit a crime, and which is an offence under section 15. Sir, can you make it slightly more simple? Listen to me carefully. The court said there is an individual A, and this individual A was sent a link, and this link had child pornography material of any form, whether it can be video, whether it can be picture, and this link was sent to A by B. And now what A is doing, listen to me carefully. What A is doing, A is simply closing the link. Closing the link. But what A is not doing, he is not destroying the link, he is not deleting the link, and he is not informing the authorities. Because you have to inform the authorities as soon as you are shown up child pornographic material, it becomes liability on you to inform it to the authorities. Since A received a child pornographic link by A, and what A is doing, A is closing this link, but A is not destroying it, not deleting this link, not informing the authorities, which means what is the intention of A? A's intention is that he would share it or transmit this child pornographic material, if not today, tomorrow. Because now A has control over this child pornographic material. That means now you have the intention of further committing a crime. That means these are inchoate offences. If your intention was not to further share it or transmit it, you would have deleted it, you would have destroyed it, or you would have informed the authorities. But since you did not, which means your intention is to further commit a crime, which is to transmit this child pornographic material. Supreme Court went a step further. Supreme Court said the power to control the material in question and the knowledge of exercise of such control. What does that mean? Court says A is watching child pornographic content online. What A is not doing? A is not downloading this material. A is not doing anything else except watching this child pornographic content on a website. Even this is a crime. Why? Because this A has the control over this material, over this child pornographic material. And he has the knowledge that I have the control. And what is this control? If A is consuming this child pornographic content online without downloading that video either, then what this A can do? He can share it. When he can share it with others, that means he has the control over this child pornographic material. This is a crime. And that is what the Supreme Court said. Even a mere possession of this child pornographic material is a crime, violating Section 15 of the POCSO Act. In fact, the court said that it is also covered under Section 67 Clause B of the Information Technology Act 2000, which prohibits, makes it a criminal offence to transmit and upload child pornographic content on the websites. But Supreme Court went a step further. What the Supreme Court said, when you look at this term pornography, it might give you a misleading explanation. In a sense, pornography is normally viewed as a consensual adult activity between two consenting adults. Children less than the age of 18 cannot give consent. That is why we should not call it child pornography. The Supreme Court is now requesting the Parliament, in a way, to suitably amend the POCSO Act. Why? Because replace this term child pornography because it might be misleading, it might trivialize this issue, and instead refer it to as child sexual exploitative and abuse material, CSEAM. Child sexual exploitative and abuse material, instead of referring it to child pornography, because pornography might give a misleading explanation, because pornography is normally associated with consenting adults doing something in a private space and consenting to it. And through this judgment, the Supreme Court has toughened the scope of this law, made this law even more stringent, and that is what is required to solve this menace of child pornography, which on one hand abuses the dignity of the child and on the other hand affects their psychological and mental capabilities as well. And that is what you need to know from this topic number 1. Watching child sex abuse material is an offence, says the Supreme Court. Let's look at another important column, India's defence exports and humanitarian law. And this is something that we have discussed, I think 7-8 days ago, when we discussed an article written by Mr. Prashant Bhushan as well. But even then, we will discuss this topic again because there are some interesting, something different that is mentioned in this editorial, in this column, which we did not cover previously. And before that, a brief background, because that will set the tone of understanding this topic. There is a problem in the Middle East. First, it started on October 7, when the terrorists from Hamas crossed the Gaza-Israeli border, killed Israeli civilians, took some of the Israeli citizens, some say more than 250 citizens, as hostages, including women, children, and elderly. Then, to ensure that these hostages are given back, these hostages are released, and to ensure that Hamas would not be in a position to perpetrate such crimes again, Israel launched an all-out war on Hamas in Gaza. But now, initially, a lot of countries of the world supported Israel. Why? Because it was doing something in its self-defense, because nobody in his right mind would justify killing and taking men, women, children, and elderly as hostages. But over a period of time, as this war continued, there were allegations that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza and other Palestinian lands. And in fact, matter went to the International Court of Justice as well. And this was the time when South Africa petitioned the International Court of Justice, arguing that Israel is committing genocide. And one definition of genocide, according to the Genocide Convention of 1948, is if you are doing something, any act through which you want to destroy, whether completely or partially, any national group, any ethnic group, any religious group, any racial group, then this amounts to genocide. And Israel was accused of committing and perpetrating genocide in Gaza. And now this war has troubled places. Now we are seeing Israel in conflict with the Houthis in Yemen, Israel in conflict with the Hezbollah of Lebanon, and whether it is Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, all of them are supported by Iran, which talks about another power rivalry between these two competing powers, Israel and Iran, in the Middle East. And now Israel has launched attacks on Hezbollah, which is considered to be one of the deadliest attacks on Lebanon since 2006. And according to the latest newspaper reports, close to 500 lives have been lost in these Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon. And Lebanon in retaliation, Hezbollah in retaliation, has also attacked various Israeli cities. So this war in the Middle East seems to be not ending anytime soon. But then if we assume for a while that Israel is committing genocide in the Middle East, in Gaza and other Palestinian lands, what about those countries who are exporting weapons, artillery, arms to Israel, and those weapons, artillery, missiles and other technology is used by Israel to perpetrate genocide in Gaza and other Palestinian lands? What about those countries? This is where a petition was filed in the Supreme Court of India. This petition, Ashok Kumar Sharma versus Union of India. What was the prayer in this case? What was the petitioner asking in this case? The petitioner asked the Supreme Court that you please direct the central government. What? That there are private companies and there are public companies as well. What they do, they export arms to Israel. And what Supreme Court was asked to do, that dear Supreme Court, please issue a directive to the central government that you should cancel licenses or withhold further licenses of those private and public companies which are exporting arms to Israel. Now, the another question that has to come into your mind is, what does India export Israel? Although you might have heard that we are dependent upon arms from Israel rather than Israel depending upon import of arms from India. But there are Indian companies, private companies, which export solid propellants to Israel, and Israel uses it for various missiles. In fact, there is a joint venture between India's DRDO and the Israeli agency for Barak missiles. These are basically mid-range surface-to-air missile or low-range surface-to-air missile. In fact, there are private companies also. For example, there is Adani, and then there is another Altis company or whatever the name is. They are in a joint venture, Elbit. They are in a joint venture for the manufacturing of unmanned aerial vehicles. India has also been exporting, allegedly, artillery shells to Israel. So whether it is solid propellants, whether it is the mid-range or low-range surface-to-air missile Barak, whether it is the unmanned aerial vehicles or artillery shells, these can be allegedly used by Israel to commit genocide and war crimes in Gaza. And that is what the petitioner argued before the court, that you should direct the central government that whether there are private companies or public companies who are exporting arms and ammunition to Israel, their licenses should be cancelled, or their further renewal of the license should be suspended, withheld. But Supreme Court rejected this petition. Why? Ground number one, Supreme Court said you are basically asking about a sovereign country, Israel, which is not a party to this case. So how can we impose a direction on a foreign country, Israel, because they are a sovereign country? We can't do that. Although there were critics, for example, Mr. Prashant Bhushan, who argued that this case was not asking the Supreme Court, this petition was not asking the Supreme Court to issue a directive to Israel. This case was about issuing a directive to the Indian government that you should suspend or cancel or withhold licenses to those Indian private and public companies who are exporting arms to Israel, and those arms can be used for aiding genocide in Gaza. Second reason why the Supreme Court did not accept this petition was it would lead to breach of contract. Because these private companies and public companies, they may be in a contract with Israel for the supply of these arms, ammunition or other items. And if you suddenly, on the directions of the court, stop selling these items, exporting these items, it may amount to breach of contract, and ultimately you will have to pay reparations for that. That is why we will not interfere. Third reason, the Supreme Court said, whatever the government of India does on this matter, what is the position it takes on this war, it's a foreign policy matter. And foreign policy is under the exclusive control and domain of the union government. We should not interfere because there is something called separation of powers. These were the three reasons given by the top court while rejecting this public interest litigation, asking the central government, asking the Supreme Court to direct the central government to suspend or withhold licenses to those private and public companies who are exporting arms to Israel, and those arms can be used for aiding genocide in Gaza. But now there is something that is mentioned in this article called international humanitarian law. What is this international humanitarian law? These are set of rules that seek to limit the effect of an armed conflict. That means basically this international humanitarian law tries to regulate, limits and imposes limits on warfare. Basically, the purpose of this international humanitarian law is to protect those persons who are not involved in this fighting, but otherwise, because of this war, may get affected because of this fighting. So how do we impose limits on warfare? Don't kill children, don't kill elderly, don't attack hospitals. All that is defined in these sets of rules known as the international humanitarian law. But you should not confuse this international humanitarian law with another principle called public international law. And this public international law is mentioned in the Charter of the United Nations. What this public international law talks about? Can one state launch an armed attack against another state? Can it happen? For that we have public international law. And can one state launch a war against another state? For that there are two exceptions provided in this public international law. Which are these two exceptions? Exception number one, if it is in self-defense. One country has attacked another country. Now this country will have to defend itself. It will launch an attack on the other country. In self-defense, it is allowed. Second, the use of force will be allowed on the authority of the United Nations Security Council. If the United Nations Security Council authorizes the use of force against a state, then it can be allowed. And that is how United Nations Security Council has approved the use of war against Iraq, when it was alleged that Iraq is making and manufacturing, stockpiling, storing the weapons of mass destruction. So one is public international law, the other is international humanitarian law. And when it comes to this international humanitarian law, for example, a court in Netherlands ordered the Dutch government that what you should do, you should stop the export of any part, any F-35 part, fighter jet parts to Israel, because then Israel can use these fighter jets to launch genocide against the innocents in Gaza. Similarly, this was on the basis of the European Union's regulation, which prohibits any country from exporting defense items to another country if that country violates international humanitarian law. So if Israel is violating this international humanitarian law, basis that European Commission has said in its regulation that any European Union country can stop, has to stop, it has the obligation to stop export of items to that country which is violating international humanitarian law. In fact, United Kingdom also, it has a law called Export Control Act. And what is this Export Control Act? It will see, United Kingdom government will see, if we are exporting defense items to another country, first we have to ensure that that country is complying with, is in agreement with, is following international humanitarian law. If it is not, then we will control the export of defense items to that country. But this article says there is no equivalent of this Export Control Act in India. That means in UK they have Export Control Act, wherein the British government will have to see that if we are exporting defense items to another country, for that first we need to assess whether that country is complying with international humanitarian law or not. Such a law is non-existent in India. But this article says we have two laws. Laws are, one is the Indian Foreign Trade Act of 1992. The other is Weapons of Mass Destruction and Their Delivery Act of 2005. Both these acts empowers the central government. That what central government you can do? You can regulate the export of designated goods. But on what grounds? On what grounds can you regulate the export of goods to other countries? In the interest of national security, in the interest of international obligations under any bilateral, multilateral, international treaty, convention. And this article says the central government can stop the export of defense items to other countries. Why? Because this law of 2005, this law of 1992, what it can do? It can prohibit the export of these items because we have international law obligations, international humanitarian law. This, the article says, is the closest that we have to Export Control Act, which is there in United Kingdom. Although in United Kingdom, the Export Control Act specifically, explicitly mentions that we have to see whether that country is complying with international humanitarian law. Then this article talks about something very interesting. When Bhamri Devi was raped, gang raped in Rajasthan, and all the accused were acquitted, one non-governmental organization, Vishakha, approached the Supreme Court in 1997, asked the Supreme Court to issue guidelines. How do we prevent the sexual harassment of women at workplaces? And there in that judgment, for the first time, because the domestic law was absent, there was no domestic law, there was no law in India which could have prevented the sexual harassment of women at workplaces. So in absence of a domestic law, for the first time, what the Supreme Court did? Supreme Court fused an international treaty into the domestic law in India. And what was that treaty? Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And when we have an international obligation to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, even if there is no domestic law which prevents sexual harassment of women at workplaces, we will fuse this international convention into our domestic law, and that is how Vishakha guidelines were made. And this article says, could the Supreme Court in Ashok Kumar Sharma case have done the same thing? But the fact of the matter is, the most important international treaty, because this is a convention, the most important international treaty is Arms Trade Treaty, which regulates international trade in arms. One section of this law says, of this arms trade treaty says, that one country may not supply arms to another country if it has the knowledge that that country is violating international humanitarian law. But India is not a signatory to Arms Trade Treaty, which means as such it is not binding on India, which means then Supreme Court could not have fused Arms Trade Treaty into our domestic law and said we can't sell items to any country if it is not complying with the international humanitarian law, because India is not a signatory, has not ratified this Arms Trade Treaty. And we had ratified CEDAW, and that is how court could have infused CEDAW into Indian laws. But the court could not have done this when it comes to Arms Trade Treaty, because we are not a signatory to it. But something else. Are we liable under international humanitarian law? If you look at Article 1 of Geneva Conventions, and these Geneva Conventions are binding on us. Article 1 of the Geneva Convention says that we have an obligation. All states will have to obey and respect international humanitarian law. That's exactly what International Court of Justice said in Nicaragua versus United States, saying this imposes a negative duty on the states. And what is that negative duty? All these countries are under obligation that you should not export items, arms, ammunition to other countries if you have the knowledge, if you have the information, if there is an expectation based on facts or knowledge that that country who will use these weapons would violate these conventions. So what this article is basically saying, when India's domestic laws, for example, weapons of mass destruction, their prohibition, similarly the Foreign Trade Act, when these two laws are read together with India's international humanitarian law obligations, then it is clear that we have a duty that we should not sell, export arms, ammunition, items to any country if it violates international humanitarian law. But this article makes an interesting suggestion. He says that instead of using the obligation under international law, saying since we have an obligation to respect international humanitarian law, that is why we are not selling, exporting items, arms to other countries who will be committing genocide. Instead, what we should do, we should amend these laws, the two laws of 1992 and 2005, to explicitly provide for something that is present in the UK Export Control Act, which is that as soon as we want to export items, arms to other country, defense equipment to another country, first we have to assess whether that country is complying with international humanitarian law. That means this IHL compliance is something that should be made mandatory, after which the export of items can take place. And what will be the impact of such a law if this law is amended like this? It will shore up, it will enhance the credibility of India, that India is a responsible defense exporting nation. Unlike other countries who are exporting technology for the manufacturing of nuclear weapons, bypassing international law, bypassing international norms, who are selling weapons to other countries, and through those weapons you want to breed terrorism in other states. So we are not a rogue state, we are a law-abiding, international humanitarian law-abiding, a responsible defense exporting state. And for that, we should have these two laws suitably amended, so that just like what we have in UK Export Controls Act, wherein there is an inbuilt provision that before exporting items to that country, we need to assess whether that country is complying with international humanitarian law as well. If it is complying, then export will take place. If not, then no export will take place. That is what you need to understand from this topic, India's defense exports and humanitarian law. Now, there is another interesting column weighing in on business as usual with China. Now, India and China have had its share of history, ups and downs, and now the relationship right now can be best termed as frosty. You would know that we fought a war in 1962, and after that we have had multiple incidents of conflict between the two countries. In fact, it is China which does not recognize that Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of India. It is China who has staked claim on Aksai Chin and illegally occupied it. It is China, which we all know has an expansionist ideology, wants to expand its territory, and that is how China has also been introducing initiatives such as Belt and Road Initiative, Maritime Silk Route, and through these routes, through these investments, it wants to expand its influence, not just providing an opportunity for its goods to be exported to other countries, but also engaging in a debt trap. By making investments in smaller countries, by giving them loans on promising rates, and when these countries default on these loans, ultimately the Chinese establishment, they take over the ports or important vital installations and militarily control them. That's the debt trap diplomacy perpetrated by China. The year was 2017, when China began to illegally make constructions in Doklam, which is at a tri-junction between India, Bhutan and China. And this time it was the proactiveness of Indian authorities that we crossed Bhutan and stopped the Chinese constructions at Doklam. So that was one standoff. Then in 2020, along the line of actual control in Ladakh, there were infiltrations by the People's Liberation Army of China, and ultimately, according to various reports, some of the territories where India would patrol previously, those territories are now under the control of China. Not my words, these are the words of this writer who has been the former ambassador to China from India. He says that there are at least 15 patrolling points where India would patrol, and now these patrolling points are under the control of China. In fact, if you look at those 8 fingers in Ladakh, all those are the genuine, legitimate part of the territory of India. But according to reports, at least 4 fingers are now captured by the Chinese. But what is this article all about? It's about economy. Can we de-risk our relationship, or can we do something of economic de-risking with China? Because in 2020, the government of India changed its FDI policy. Foreign direct investment coming to India, you would know, can come through multiple routes. One is the automatic route, for which no approval is required. The other is government route, for which the approval is required. And in 2020, the government of India changed its FDI policy, saying if an entity wants to invest in India, but this entity shares land border with India, is belonging to a country which shares land border with India, this entity will have to invest in India through FDI, but through government approval route. Cannot be through automatic approval. There were some people at that time, including China, which alleged that This is something that FDI policy has been changed in India, keeping in mind China, because we share land boundary with India. And that is why you want to restrict Chinese companies' investments into India. That is your principal objective. But the government of India's objective was not this. The government of India's objective was to prevent the hostile takeover of Indian companies during COVID-19 pandemic. That was the stated objective of the government of India, and that is why those countries which share land boundary with India, if the entities from those countries, they want to invest in India through FDI, they have to necessarily take the approval of the government. That means through government route. But be that as it may, Economic Survey of 2024 talks about something. What does it say? Listen to me carefully. There are supply chain shocks in the world, right? India is an important exporter. That's why some efforts were made to boost manufacturing in India. And that is how a scheme was launched called Make in India by the Prime Minister. Although the principal objective was to boost manufacturing so that India can also become a solid exporter of finished goods to the rest of the world. So the idea was to make India another factory of the world. Former RBI Governor, Mr. Raghuram Rajan, he says that it should not have been Make in India. It should have been Make in India for India. That means we should not be making in India so that we want to export it. We should be making in India to meet the domestic demands of the people of India, because we have such a massive market. Because according to Raghuram Rajan, the world will not accept another factory, another China. But there were supply chain constraints, shocks during the COVID-19 as well, and even afterwards as well. And we want to make our country as a solid country because we want to be present in the global supply chains. For that, Economic Survey notes that if we cannot attract FDI from China, can we at least ensure that Chinese companies will make investments in India rather than we importing these products from China? That's what Economic Survey says of 2024. That means this Economic Survey favors that India should plug into this China's supply chains. How? We should not import from China, but we should allow Chinese investments into India so that through these Chinese investments, we can be part of the global supply chain. But this article heavily criticizes this outlook of the Economic Survey. Why? On various grounds. One such ground is, do not trust the Chinese. Right now, the government of India is in talks with the government of China, according to various newspaper reports, to solve these outstanding issues that we have faced since the skirmishes along the line of actual control in 2020. Although there are reports which say that most of these problems have been ironed out, but still there is no consensus on the Depsang Plains, Demchok, which has been illegally occupied by China. In this backdrop, we need to understand two important terms: Track 2 and Track 1.5. And before that, Track 1. And these are the terms that are used in diplomacy. Government of a country, its political leaders, its officials, directly talking and negotiating with the government and official figures of another country. This is what we call Track 1. Government to government, officers to officers, officials to officials contact. That's how they can resolve conflicts. whether it is the conflict along the line of actual control, whether it is the conflict with the stapled pin visas, because Chinese would give stapled visa rather than stamped visa to those from Jammu and Kashmir who would visit China, those from Arunachal who would visit China. This was their way of saying that we don't recognize these two territories as an integral part of India. And if we want to resolve this, either government and government should come together and resolve, or we should go for track 2 diplomacy. And what is this track 2 diplomacy? Where officials will not be part of the diplomacy. Where officials and officials are not meeting. Civil society and civil society is meeting. Non-officials and non-officials are meeting. But obviously they have the support of the state. They have the support of the government. So once they meet, they go back to their respective governments and say this is what they are talking about. Is this effective? It is. Because the Oslo Accords signed between Palestine and Israel, it began as a track 2 diplomacy. When non-officials from Palestine and Israel, they came together, started negotiating. Because when they negotiate, they don't have any baggage. They are not constrained by the protocol. And it is only when this track 2 diplomacy became successful, that's when the heads of the governments met and ultimately tried to resolve some of their problems. Where Palestine recognized Israel, Israel recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization headed by Yasser Arafat as the legitimate government of Palestinian people. So in track 2 diplomacy, officials are not present. It's a people-to-people contact, backroom, backstage. In track 1 diplomacy, there is government and government present, officials and officials present. So what is this track 1.5? Officials are present, but not in their official capacity, in their personal capacity. So there can be a major of the army, there can be an important functionary of the army who will be part of these meetings, or an important foreign service officer part of these meetings, but not as officials, not under the mandate of the government. They are participating as individuals. This article says a lot of these track 1.5 and track 2 diplomacies between India and China, which we have witnessed over the past, it gives a clear sense that China knows and accepts that status quo has changed. And what is that status quo? Status quo in the sense, yes, there were these territories which were under Indian control. China has occupied these territories. Now Indians have been pushed back. That means the status quo has been altered. China in these track 1.5, track 2 diplomacies, they tell Indian counterparts that yes, we know this status quo has changed, but now deal with it. Live with it. Let's focus on economy. Let's focus on economic ties. Allow more Chinese journalists to visit India. Don't discriminate against Chinese companies when they have to invest in India. Let's focus on that rather than going back to status quo. In such a scenario, how can you trust Chinese, according to this writer? Number 2, there is a huge trade deficit between India and China. And China is not willing to address this trade deficit. If you look at the data, according to International Trade Center, India's trade deficit with China exceeded $105 billion, which was $64 billion in 2021. Our exports have also declined, but we are still dependent upon the import of Chinese goods into India. So there is this huge trade deficit between the two countries, and China is not willing to address it by encouraging exports from India. Third, there are other countries of the world, for example, United States, for example, West, Europe, who consider that India can be an alternative to China when it comes to developing supply chain networks, global supply chain. But if the report of the economic survey is to be accepted, that we want Chinese investments into India so that we can have Chinese-led global supply chain from India, then how can US and other countries of the world consider India as an attractive alternative to develop factories and industries and set up supply chain from India? That is why we should not do this. China, its objective is to dominate future industries. Future industries, for example, lithium-ion battery, for example, electric vehicles. China is exporting technology, know-how to other countries. But it is doing this in such a manner that China is telling its own policy makers that you should ensure that you are exporting in such a way that we are prioritizing domestic consumption. What does that mean? China's objective of dominating future industries, including critical sectors such as electric vehicles, solar equipment, lithium-ion, and they are exporting all these things. They are not producing it for domestic consumption only, exporting as well. That is how China wants to dominate this future industry. But what China has advised its car makers is that this advanced electric vehicle technology should not be transferred to other countries. So you make it in China only. You can export the finished goods, but technology should remain, technological know-how should remain in China, according to MERIX, Mercator Institute for China Studies. Again, when it comes to imports from China, the expectation is that if we allow more imports from China, it can be reduced by boosting FDI from China. So what? If we want Chinese investments in India so that the Chinese companies can make in India, which means then we don't need to import items from China, which means then India will become part of the global supply chain, which means instead of getting exported from China, these goods will be exported from India. This would be naive to expect. Why? Because FDI experience from other countries tell us that ASEAN, for example, imports from China increased from 386 billion to 438 billion in 2023. So just because Chinese investments are happening in ASEAN countries, that does not mean that the imports from China is reducing because now you are manufacturing in your own countries. No, experience tells us something else. So all this picture tells us that we can't trust China, particularly when it comes to economy. So there is no need for economic de-risking versus China. And let's not forget, China is not a market economy. And you would know what a market economy is, that it's not driven by the invisible hands of demand and supply. The production is not driven because of that. There has been a long-term allegation against China is that it is devaluing its currency. And when you devalue your currency, which means your exports will become competitive in the global market. Long story short, if Economic Survey 2024 said that if we want to be part of the global supply chain, for that instead of importing from China, we should have Chinese investments into India so that we can make in India and ultimately then export to other countries and be part of the global supply chain. We will be supplying goods. This would be naive according to this writer. Why? Because the experience tells us that even if investments, FDI investments into India from China increases, that does not mean that the exports will reduce. Even if FDI investments come to India, but China would still want to dominate the future industries such as solar power manufacturing, such as electric vehicles, such as lithium-ion, because they have told their car makers that you should not export the advanced technological know-how to other countries. So China, by that way, is imperialistic in nature. That is the crux of this article. Let's look at some of the prelims-based questions. Badlapur, prelims-based topics. Badlapur accused killed in retaliatory fire by police. An individual, 24-year-old, he was accused of sexually assaulting two young girls at a school in Badlapur town in Maharashtra. And now it is argued, according to the police, that he tried to snatch the pistol from a police officer, and then he also tried to shoot one, which injured a police constable, and then in retaliatory fire, he was shot dead. This is what we call police encounter. But what do we need to know from this topic? Two things. One, what are the National Human Rights Commission guidelines when it comes to police encounter? And number two, delay in justice has now morphed into a social issue. Whenever such extrajudicial killings happen, somebody killed in a fake police encounter, I'm not suggesting for once that this was a fake police encounter, but I'm just talking about the larger issue, whether somebody is killed in a fake encounter, the people like it. The people appreciate it, saying this is instant justice, quick justice. Why? Because they don't trust the judiciary. In what way? That if this case would reach to the courts will take their own sweet time to pronounce the guilt, and ultimately 7, 8, sometimes 10, 12 years will be lost, and finally justice will be given to this perpetrator. But we don't want to wait for 12, 13 years to give him justice. We want instant justice. So this judicial pendency, where the cases are pending in the courts for a long time, it has morphed into a social issue, where now people are justifying these extrajudicial killings. Number two, what are the NHRC guidelines? NHRC, which is the statutory body under the Protection of the Human Rights Act 1993, this National Human Rights Commission has laid down guidelines whenever such police encounter takes place. It says, as soon as the information about the death being caused in a police encounter is received, the officer in charge of a police station must record it in the appropriate register. So as soon as you hear a death of somebody in a police encounter, the nearest police station, the in charge of that police station, the guideline is that you have to necessarily mention it in your register. And then investigation has to take place. But this investigation should be normally carried out by an independent agency. For example, Criminal Investigation Department, CID. Why? Because if the encounter of this man happened in the police lockup or in the police custody, how can the same police investigate whether this was a fake encounter or a genuine encounter? Because their officers are themselves part of it. I'm not saying part of the fake encounter, but part of this exercise. So to ensure, because you can't be the judge in your own case, to ensure that principles of natural justice are followed, an independent criminal investigation department should invariably conduct this investigation. And this investigation should be monitored by the magistrate. This is what we call magisterial inquiry should be held in all cases where death has occurred in the course of police action. And whenever such a magisterial inquiry, which means on the orders of the court, let's say the district magistrate is carrying out this inquiry. Now you are carrying out this inquiry not as a court, but as an officer for justice, which means you will not give verdict. You will only give report as to who caused this police encounter, what led to it, whether it is fake or not. And whenever such an inquiry is conducted, the kith and kin, the next of the family of this victim, should also be involved. They should be associated with the inquiry. And once the report is given, then quick prosecution should happen. Disciplinary action should be initiated against those who have violated the law and killed a person in the fake encounter. Similarly, whether a compensation should be given to the victim's family or not, that will be decided on case-to-case basis, because that will vary depending upon the circumstances of each case. But previously, what would happen? Police would be encouraged to perform these extrajudicial killings, fake encounters. Why? Because whenever a rapist or an alleged rapist or an alleged criminal was killed in a fake encounter, the very next day, gallantry award was announced for this police officer. This will encourage me to kill more such people. But whether they are innocent or guilty, that's for the court to decide. Police cannot decide whether you are innocent or guilty. The golden rule of criminal justice system is you are innocent until proven otherwise. What if this person was innocent? What if? Big if. What if this person was innocent? Which means the real perpetrator is roaming around freely and we will never be able to catch that person. By extinguishing the life of this individual, if it was a fake encounter, you have also buried justice. So NHRC guidelines say, no out of turn promotion. You were meant to be promoted as a head constable, you are promoted as the deputy superintendent of the police. No out of turn promotion, no instant gallery award should be given to this concerned officer unless and until it is proven that this person was not guilty. And the NHRC guidelines also tell us that in all the cases where deaths happen due to police action, the Director General of Police has to give a 6th monthly statement to the NHRC and has to submit this 6th monthly statement by January 15 and July 15 every year, giving statement details of all the instances where deaths have occurred due to police action. So by reading this newspaper article, you should not just read that this person has been killed. You should go into what can be asked in the exam, what can be relevant for the examination. The larger issue is the delay in justice is morphing into a social issue with potential ramifications for India's democracy. And second, what are the NHRC guidelines? Then the last topic that we shall be discussing today, FSSAI issues notice to Tamil Nadu firm over ghee adulteration. An unfortunate controversy in a sacred temple in Tirupati, where it was alleged that the laddus, which have a GI tag, geographical indicator tag, these laddus were made up of ghee which was adulterated. And in fact, other concerns have also been raised. But what is this Food Safety and Standards Authority of India? First thing you need to understand, it is a statutory body. This statutory body was established in 2008. When it is a statutory body, that means it is a body created under a law, Food Safety and Standards Act. This law was passed in the year 2006. But what is the purpose? What is the objective of this Food Safety and Standards Authority of India? What FSSAI does, it regulates. What does it regulate? Manufacture, storage, distribution, sale, and even import of food items. Not just manufacture, but storage, distribution, sale, import of food items. It also regulates labeling. Whether the food is a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian. It also regulates and tells the food companies that you should provide nutritional information. That is why it should, if whatever you are eating, consuming, you can see at the back side there will be nutritional information available. Calories, trans fats, saturated fats, so on and so forth. All that is regulated by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. This authority also regulates and specifies the limits of contaminants, additives, in fact, pesticides that can be used in the food items. So pesticide in the food items, just check out when you are drinking, if at all you're drinking a Coke or a Thumbs Up or a Pepsi, which does contain pesticides. So use regulating the limits, the quantity of pesticides, contaminants, additives that can be used in the food. That is all that is regulated by this Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Basic facts may be relevant for your prelims examination. Let's look at 2 practice questions for mains, and let me check if you have any questions till now so that I can answer. Any questions as of now? Okay, all clear. If it is all clear, don't forget to like this video as well once the session is over. 2 practice questions for mains. Number 1, India needs to shore up its credibility as a responsible defense exporting nation. Comment. And this is where you can talk about whatever was written in that article, where we need to amend suitably our 2 laws of 1992 and 2005 to ensure that any export of arms, ammunition, we must ensure that that country which is importing our items is in compliance with the international humanitarian law. And if that is something which we see in the Export Control Act of United Kingdom, if that is something that we can implement in India, it will enhance the credibility of India in international forum. And the world will recognize that India is a responsible defense exporting nation. It's not a rogue state. Question number 2, examine the significance of the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act and Safeguarding Children's Rights. Discuss how recent Supreme Court judgments have strengthened the implementation and the scope of this act. That is it for now. I'll see you again tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning. Till then, have a great time and do consider subscribing to our channel. And I'll see you again at 6 o'clock in the evening with lecture number 5 of Our Constitution at Work, which is a textbook in political science for class 11th. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye. Take care. Stay safe.